Welcome to Global Justice Report, a new online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand. I'll be your host for this webinar. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic alternatives, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and much, much more. We are open to suggestions for future webinars. We have webinars right now scheduled up until January, but there will be openings in the schedule after that. If you have an idea for a webinar, you can send it to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. That's also where you can send your questions. Following the talks by our two speakers, we will have a Q&A session. We invite you to submit questions and comments, which I will then relay to our speakers. And this is the email address to use. I'll post that again later. October 12th today is First Peoples Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, as it is also called. It used to be called Columbus Day. The day has been repurposed to honor the original inhabitants of this hemisphere, rather than the Europeans who conquered their lands and carried out genocide against them. There is little to celebrate in all of that, but there is much to be remembered. Before Columbus, there were multiple cultures living on the commons of this hemisphere. The English came for their land, the Spanish came for their gold. Both found the original peoples to be in their way and conquered or exterminated them. Nevertheless, their descendants today are often bearers of cultural identities alternative to the world created by the European conquerors. Our modern world, with its individualism, materialism, and domination of nature. Now, that modern world is beset by multiple crises: a deadly pandemic, climate catastrophe, economic collapse, and a dispiriting malaise. Perhaps there's much we can learn from the first peoples, from their values of bon vivre, from living in harmony in nature, from their communal societies. Our speakers today are Gustavo Esteva and David Barkin. They will highlight some of the values and visions of a good life that are part of societies that many indigenous cultures and those who share their ideals offer as alternatives to the dominant values of Western culture. David Barkin is a professor of economics at Xochimilco campus of the Universidad Autonoma Metropolitana in Mexico City. He's a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences and of the National Research Council. He's interested in the process of unequal development that creates profound imbalances throughout society and promotes environmental degradation. His recent research focuses on the implementation of alternative strategies for the development management of resources. Much of his work is conducted in collaboration with local communities and regional citizens groups. Our second speaker, Gustavo Esteva, is one of the most well-known Mexican scholars and activists, and an advocate of post-development. He describes himself as a deprofessionalized intellectual and has published over 40 books and numerous articles dealing with the topics of development critique, indigenous rights, and commonality, among others. He writes for La Jornada and lives in a small Zapotec village in Oaxaca. If Gustavo is a deep professionalized intellectual, David Barkin might be called a deep professionalized economist, or at least I heard him recently, or maybe a repentant economist, I don't know. But I heard him distancing himself from that professional label recently. But let me give the floor first to David. He'll have about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll turn to Gustavo. Okay, David, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. In Mexico, today is called Dia de la Raza. And I think that it's important to understand the significance of that. In fact, there is a substantial debate today that the president of Mexico relit in his morning press conference because he several months ago wrote a letter saying that the King of Spain, the Spaniards, should be apologetic for the conquest of the Western Hemisphere. That request itself was quite controversial here in Mexico, and most recently, the Zapatista leadership has said we have nothing to ask them for apology. We're building our own world, and we continue to build our own world. And as the Zapatistas phrase it, they're building their own world, a world in which many other worlds can fit. And I think that that's an apt expression of what we might expect today, a world in which many other worlds might fit. This is very, very important if we think about what, as you call it, First Peoples Day means. And when you made your introduction, Cliff, you said the Spanish came and exterminated the peoples of this continent. I think that it's really important to understand, no, they did not. They brought death and destruction on a massive scale. They brought smallpox. They brought lots of problems. But even in Mexico City, they did not destroy the city. The city, when they came, was probably the largest urban area on the face of the earth. and today is one of the largest. There were perhaps 500,000 people living in the Valley of Mexico at the, some people say even more, at the time of the conquest. But to talk today, and in the context of the Global Justice Center, what I want to do is present some ideas of the extraordinary creativity, resilience, and autonomy that First Peoples are exhibiting in their process of advancing and changing the nature of Mexican society. And to do so, I'm going to present a few PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to share the screen. Roberto, is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
I wrote an article with several of my students a long time, a year and a half ago or so, which we talked about collective communitarian subjects. It's a very important way of thinking about the way in which the communities are working and building alternative structures of the way in which society might is developing. The important thing about these community, these groups, is that they view the world quite differently from the way in which the mainstream and the international community views the world. Instead of a fragmentary nature of law, the communities are are insisting on an integrated nature of customary law, a way which is being translated throughout the whole world in mechanisms of counter mapping, a way in which you understand and look at the mechanisms that a community lives in an integrated way, joining production with knowledge, with culture, with cosmologies, in a mechanism for understanding that the community is not a set of separate spaces, but an integrated space where women, children, and men are all involved in a collective process of producing, reproducing, and enriching society. And in the process, very, very importantly, conserving and rehabilitating their natural spaces. In Latin America, the process by which this takes place is often referred to as a diálogo de saberes, a mechanism by which a process is social, political, and educational process by which we are invited to exchange concepts, to enrich concepts between the knowledge systems of these hundreds of communities throughout the Americas, which involve new ways of learning, creating a new theoretical reflection, integrating theory and practice, a new kind of pluralism, and which we have been fortunate enough to be able to be invited to collaborate directly with the communities in a new forms of democracy, not the kind of representative democracy which has led to the corruption that we're seeing both in Mexico and particularly on the eve of the election in the United States today. But most significantly, these communities are involved in a process of constructing post-capitalist societies. I want to pause a moment and talk about this because what this concept of post-capitalist societies is perhaps a little controversial. The notion that these communities are effectively eliminating the proletarian social relationships within their communities, and that extends to changing the gender relations to create a more strident demand for universal participation within the community and a greater participation of the communities with the larger areas within which they live. These post-capitalist societies are creating international networks, which are very, very important. I don't have time right now in this discussion to talk about the indigenous community and conservation area network, which is involved right now in 81 countries and has thousands of indigenous communities that are members of it, or the network that has been created and is expanding of the Via Campesina, which is promoting a very, very important approach, innovative approach to creating these societies, to strengthening these societies, involving, as we will see in a few minutes, the demand and implementation of policies for food self-sufficiency. This cover of a magazine that comes out monthly in Latin America called America Latina en Movimiento is an example, is the cover of a special issue which was dedicated to the notion of buen vivir, which might be translated as living well, or sumac causai, which is the Quechua origins of these terms. Throughout the Americas, there's a beginning, a new realization that perhaps it's absolutely necessary in light of what we're talking about today, Cliff, as the First Peoples Day, to understand that there's that words matter, and therefore the territories within the Americas are now thinking of calling the continent Abya Yala. Abya Yala, a particular kind of, it's a term used by the Guna people for talking about our territory. Our territory, the territories that were occupied by the indigenous peoples long before the Europeans came to the to what we call the Western Hemisphere today. And so I included this cover as a reminder of the extraordinary variety of forms of expression of the alternative epistemologies, the alternative cosmologies, which are very much a part of building a new connection of communities. To build these communities, there are a number of principles that have been are considered to be the basic elements of such a the construction of these post-capitalist societies. I won't go into the details of these. Fortunately, I understand that all of this whole slide presentation will be available on the Global Justice Center platform for posterity. But an example, an important example, an important policy implication of the construction of this alternative way of looking has to do with food sovereignty. Food sovereignty as part of a whole series of sovereignties and autonomies, which the communities are trying to build, which involves not only production, but the involvement of the communities themselves in the control of local control of socio-political processes, which emphasizes the biocultural nature of the occupation of territories and the different relationship between society and the nature, the Pachamama, as is the expression that comes out of Peruvian society. This involves an enhancement and a strengthening of social production and a collaboration with sensitive scientific and technical groups that are working to enhance the traditional production through various paradigms, mostly now understood as agroecologies. But agroecologies, I want to emphasize, as a plural term rather than agroecology as it's understood traditionally. And the food sovereignty movement involves the strengthening of and the extension of democratic organizations. And in Mexico, in one particular way, this is taking the form of the expression comunalidad, which is a particularly strong mechanism, strong approach in Oaxaca. The effects of this are to create integrated management of the natural heritage, water, forests, land, control of emissions, promotion of biodiversity, as well as an attention to social integration and health through social, racial, ethnic equality or equalities, and the very, very important transformation of labor and intergenerational relationships. One of the exciting, from our perspective, exciting results of this is the communities are able to produce surplus, that is more than they need for their basic subsistence, and they are going about in a collective way redistributing this among their communities to promote reciprocity in their community, among their members. And of course, this involves revaluing local knowledge, creating space for new developments. And in ending my presentation today, Cliff and people from the Global Justice Center, I want to talk about a number of initiatives that are going on in the communities to implement this process. One is to reappropriate the initiative of Padre Miguel Hidalgo in the 18th century, who spent years of his life as a preacher, the father of the Mexican, who's often called the father of the Mexican independence, prior to his role at the beginning of the 19th century, that he spent many, many years distributing mulberry seeds to among the peoples in central Mexico to produce these beautiful trees, which not only produce fruit. Oh, and look at this, I made a mistake in my English. But produce feed for silkworms. I put silkworms. And produce forage for livestock, are enhancing landscapes, and we have more recently understood ingredients for pharmaceuticals. The mulberry tree is a perfect example of the way in which knowledge, international knowledge, has enhanced the ability of communities to consolidate and diversify their productive systems. Another area which has become increasingly important recently is the realization of the importance of Mexico as a center, as a biological center, as what's called a Vavilov center for cotton. Cotton has been grown, has been cultivated in Mexico for more than 3,500 years. And today we have identified throughout Mexico 43 different colors of cotton. What you see in the picture are natural colors of cotton, and are now giving rise to a whole series of ways in which the cotton, which fortunately cannot be monocropped, these cottons must be intercropped with food and fruit and vegetable and food of different kinds to provide an additional way of creating opportunities for the well-being of the peoples involved in these in this activity. We have now identified 10 states in Mexico where cotton is being produced. And to end up, what I would like to talk about also is this particular kind of maize. It's called Oloton maize, which comes from the Sierra Mije of Oaxaca, and has been developed over the past 200 years as an extraordinary variety of maize, which can fix nitrogen from the air and enrich the soils and ensure its own abundance. The extraordinary thing about this Oloton maize is that it is now the subject of an international research project and a demand by the Mexican National Science and Technology Council, because a group of North American scientists at the University of California, Davis, have done research in a very unethical way that is expected to lead to international legal conflicts, because they are likely, together with their partner, the Mars Corporation, one of the largest agro-food companies in the world, to try to patent this maize, the genes in this maize, to create nitrogen-fixing varieties. So what I want to, in concluding, what I want to do is simply say, as an introduction to this talk about First Peoples, is that the extraordinary variety of cultures, of cultural systems, of peoples, and the imagination that these peoples continue to offer for the well-being, for their own well-being, but for the well-being of society, and the ability to conserve and enrich the natural ecosystems in which they live, offers an example of what we must learn in order to face and prepare ourselves better for the profound crises, natural crises, epidemiological crises that we're facing today. The book that is in the middle is a collection of essays that I wrote, and on the right is the reference to an article that we published that provides an introduction to some of these materials. Thank you very much, Cliff.
Oh, thank you, David. Very interesting. I now want to remind people that if you have questions, you can email them to us. And after we finish with our Gustavo's presentation, we will entertain questions both for David and Gustavo. And this is the email address to use: global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. But now let me turn the floor over to Gustavo Esteva for his presentation. In introducing him, I forgot to mention that he was the founder of Universidad de la Tierra, a rather unique institution in Oaxaca. Gustavo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cliff. I hope I am okay in the connection, because it has been failing all the time. And thank you for the invitation. Well, this day is no longer, if it ever was, a day to just remember. It should be a day of awareness. We need to be fully aware that there is something worse than the occupation of our territories and our bodies, exposed for centuries to exploitation and destruction. Our soul, our internal being, has been dramatically colonized, and we have been unable to liberate ourselves from that colonial prison. Words are the doors of perception, words and windows of perception. Depending on the words we use, we experience the world. We can no longer use our own words, the words expressing our own way of being. We are forced to use words imposed on us. The words of the colonizers became not only the official language. The school was created everywhere to de-Indianize the Indians, when instead of genocide, they opted for culturicide for those remaining. The main tool of colonization was the elimination of our language, our own words. We were schooled in an alien language. The operation was a massive success for the colonizers. Millions of people ceased to be who they were to become something else. The majority of the population became the minority of the population. Only a few were able to resist and survive with their own vocabulary, with their own way of being in the world. Let's explore a few cases of the impact of this kind of colonization. To talk of natural resources, mere commodities, to allude to Mother Earth, is like to call prostitutes our mothers. Such treatment allows not only to occupy it, to use it, to exploit it, it also allows to destroy it. They use euphemisms like climate change or global warming to hide what has been doing. A terricidio, as the Mapuches said, the assassination of Mother Earth. They have thus produced climate collapse. The climate we had is no longer there, and we know very little about the one emerging. We don't know if it will be compatible with human life. All this is allowed by the expression natural resources. When we are no longer seeing the earth as our mother that nourishes us, but as a commodity, something you can buy and sell in the market and exploit for private gain. This is an expression that also betrays the original meaning of the word resources. As Vandana Shiva once explained, resource evoked the image of a spring, sound like spring. A resource rises again and again, even if it has been repeatedly used. The concept highlighted nature's power of self-regeneration and called attention to her prodigious creativity. It also implied the relationship between humans and nature, that the earth bestows gifts on humans who in turn should not suffocate her generosity. In early modern times, resource suggested reciprocity and regeneration. Industrialism and colonialism produced a conceptual break. Natural resources became those parts of nature needed for industrial production and colonial trade. We all know what happened then. Let's think in another word of common use. As David mentioned, we are still using a word that means government of the people to allude to a system created to ensure the indefinite reproduction of a political elite to impose its will on the people. The real power of the people is reduced to a marginal intervention in which it is assumed that the statistical aggregation of individual votes can be taken as the expression of the collective will. It is very difficult to still find a person that really believes in the two most important democratic institutions without which no democratic society can exist. The belief of the majority that people freely define who is in government and that those elected really represent the interest of that majority and are at its service. The current situation in all democratic societies, particularly in the United States, that created the modern form of democracy that became the universal model, allows us to see the contrast with what our own people are still doing in our communities. We are, of course, exposed to all kinds of interventions by the market and the state. We are also exposed to local bosses, which often interfere with our decisions and affect our daily life. But even with those limitations, we can express in our assemblies our collective will and create what really is people's government. What the Zapatistas say about their communities, here the people are in command and the government obeys, also applies to our own communities. The case of the so-called pandemic may illustrate the point. With the use of this equivocal word, the governments were able to produce the passive obedience of more than half the people on earth, something without precedent, to global instructions and policies increasingly exposed to serious critique. The campaign generating everywhere unprecedented fear was supposedly based on scientific knowledge, with the science that until now, 10 months later, has been unable to appropriately characterize the disease and even less to recommend appropriate measures of prevention and treatment. We all know what has been implemented everywhere and its consequences. I would like to describe, in contrast, what has been done in many communities of Oaxaca. They closed the community. No person was allowed to come in. Even migrants returning home or relatives of members of the community were forced to stay in an external quarantine. All suppliers were stopped at the entrance of the community. No junk food, particularly drinks like Coke, were allowed to come in. All needed products were properly sanitized. Inside the communities, special care and protection, this is very important for us, special care and protection was given to people of all age or with health problems like diabetes, high blood pressure, hepatitis, and other diseases. They carefully reflected on their eating practices to strengthen the appropriate consumption of healthy local food. There was a clear intensification in all the activities associated with the local production of food, particularly for the regeneration of the milpa, the traditional cultivation of corn, beans, and squash. Local remedies with different herbs and preparations were used for prevention and treatment. Some of these communities have no infections until now. There has been a number of cases in some of them, and very few deaths, in both cases with a much lower rate than in the rest of the country and the world. These communities took very seriously the threat, but took very effective decisions to deal with it, based in their own tradition and the appropriate juxtaposition of other medical knowledge. We must consider that in most indigenous languages in Mexico, there is no word for health or disease. They have a radically different notion of a healthy life, and it is very difficult to find words in English or in Spanish to express what they think and do when someone in the community has what we call a disease. It is always a communal affair. The community asks itself, what is happening in the communal life that may have caused that condition in Don Rafael, in Doña Juanita? It's not an individual problem. It's not a problem of that individual patient. It's a problem of the community, and the community assumes its responsibility for that specific condition. This is, of course, associated with the notion of the individual. In some indigenous languages, like the Tojolabal, one of the Zapatista languages, there are no words for I and you, and they have many we's. If they and I are talking, they have one we. If we include Cliff, that is another we. If we include the whole community, that is another we. They are weing all the time. They don't have a verb to say, I speak. They cannot say something like I speak. They have a verb that includes speaking and listening, always including the other. It's not unilateral verbs. It's not possible to think or to speak in Tojolabal with unilateral verbs. These are only a few examples of ideas and behavior among the indigenous peoples. And an expression, by the way, they are no longer accepting, they are not indigenous peoples, that are today sources of inspiration for many non-indigenous peoples. In the modern society, there is an increasingly vigorous trend that challenges the very notion of the individual. As Ramon Panikkar observed, we can believe we are individuals because we have been constructed as such. We can feel as individuals. We can struggle for the individual we believe we are, and also struggle for what we call individual rights. But we cannot be individuals if we are still humans. We are not in nets of relations, not an individual pole of the relations, but the relations themselves. This approach is currently being used for the courageous and badly needed reconstruction of the cells of a new society. There is the increasing conviction that we are at the end of an era, the end of patriarchy, the end of capitalism, the end of the democratic nation state. The new society will no longer be a supposed pact among individuals, but the accord between communities for their harmonious coexistence, with proper arrangements for the interaction between those nets of relationships, which may become the basic cells of the new society. The so-called pandemic was an opportunity to discover the real nature of capitalism. Since it was born, capitalist society was presented as a system offering a desirable way of life for most people. It was assumed that its well-known defects, like inequality, exploitation, environmental destruction, violence, and many others, could be addressed through the appropriate reforms and government. Failed or ceased to be an attractive option in the 90s, capitalism does not only appear as the only option left, but it's a very good option. Fukuyama became famous when he announced the end of history and declared that we cannot even conceive something better than the marriage of capitalism and liberal democracy. And many people believed him. That is why he became so famous. The crisis of 2008 and its aftermath weakened that conviction. The experience of the last months has been for an increasing number of people a time of awakening. They were able to experience both the horrors of the usual conditions and an alternative. Confinement, staying at home the whole day with the family, became in many cases highly problematic, a source of violence and depression, particularly when the house was transformed into an office or a school. But it also became an opportunity to discover another way of eating, playing, loving, enjoying family life, which was no longer reserved for weekends and holidays, but as a way of life. And many people started to explore how to live that way, with or without the virus. Most people in modern society don't have a community behind them, don't have a solid we defining who they are, expressing their fundamental identity. Constructed as individuals since the day they were born, they have been following an individual path, affiliated to categories and organizations constituted of aggregations of individuals. They may feel inspired by what they see among the indigenous people, but don't think they can do something similar. Perhaps they may consider friendship, not ideology or activism, as the proper key for the social reconstruction we badly need. I do not believe, said Ivan Illich in 1996, that friendships today can flower out of political life. I do believe that if there is something like a political life to remain for us in this world of technology, then it begins with friendship. Therefore, my task is to cultivate disciplined, self-denying, careful, tasteful friendships, because perhaps here we can find what the good is. This goes beyond anything which people usually talk about, saying each one of you is responsible for the friendships she can develop. Because society will only be as good as the political result of these friendships. I do think, he added, that if I had to choose one word to which hope can be tied, it is hospitality. A practice of hospitality, recovering threshold, table, patience, listening, and from there generating seedbeds for virtue and friendship on the one hand, on the other hand, radiating out for possible community, for rebirth of community. That seems to be, in fact, the path ahead of us, the rebirth of community. And let me add one point. I agree with David in the expression of the Zapatistas. We are trying to construct not one world, one alternative world, but a world in which many worlds can fit, he said. I would say I prefer to translate the original expression of the Zapatistas, a world in which many worlds can be embraced. Gracias, Cliff.
Well, thank you, Gustavo, for another very provocative, stimulating presentation. Now we come to the opportunity for our viewers to present questions or comments. Please send them by email. If you're on Zoom, do not put it in the chat box because I may not see them. The best way to get your question in is to send it as an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And if you put in the subject line question, I'll be able to spot it more easily among the other emails. While we wait for your questions to arrive, let me just present a thought that occurred to me as well, Gustavo, as you were speaking about how Oaxaca, in response to the pandemic, excluded people from outside to come in. And I know that that happened in many, many other places. Communities that did not have any of the pandemic and knew that it would be outsiders coming in who could bring the virus. And that reminded me of the practice of the Zapatistas. In order to build their own world, found it necessary to close themselves off from the outside world, not completely, but to control access from the outside. In a caracol is where it becomes possible to build a community, to build a world that is one's own. Any reflections on that? You want to develop that thought some?
Yeah, because I could say that this closeness that the people operate frequently is combined with the principle I mentioned of hospitality. I have been always impressed by the fact that these people can still be hospitable. They were hospitable with Cortés. They were hospitable with all the colonizers. They have been hospitable with foreign technologies destroying their reality. They have been experiencing all kinds of hospitality abuses, and they are still hospitable. They are still open their arms and hearts to others. And this is happening even during the COVID-19, because they are closed. Yes, there are no strange person is allowed, but in some specific cases, after the quarantine, controlled quarantine, the person can come in and be hospitable, accepted. And they are interacting with others in that specific way, full of hospitality. Yes, you need to be in control, but this control is not a dogmatic control, is not the attitude of the European countries about migrants. It's not this kind of condition. It's not the use of borders, but a different kind of attitude, that it is you are in your own place, you are caring for this piece of the Mother Earth that is your responsibility. You need to care for it. And for that, you are closed, but at the same time, you are open. You are in control of the openness, and you are hospitable to the others. Cliff, there is something I would like to say that I could not include in my presentation to adjust to the 15 minutes, 20 minutes limit. But if we have a little time, I would like to say something about what David opened about post-capitalism. Yes, we can discuss forever if, as many of us believe, capitalism is dead because it cannot reproduce itself in some terms any longer. That is a very technical discussion that perhaps we cannot have here now. But there is one specific point I would like to mention. What we have now, what the Zapatistas call the World War, the Fourth World War, in which we all are, it is because we have the end of class struggle. Because in the 90s, a new social class was created, the class of disposable humans, the class of people for which capital has no use now or in the future. In the past, the surplus population was always functional for capitalism. It was the industrial reserve army. After the 90s, there is a massive group of people that are disposable human beings. And these disposable human beings started to be disposed of. This is the problem that we are suffering today in the world. This is the war described by the Zapatistas. They said this in 1994, saying we don't want to be disposed of as they are doing with us. That is against the principle of class struggle. The classes, the two classes struggle against each other in a dispute, but they need each other for the social relation of capitalism. They need, the bourgeoisie need the workers, and the workers need a capital for their employment, for their work, etc. What we have now is that capital, in the current situation, what remains of capital does not longer need millions of people, and they are disposing of them. This is what we are seeing today in the world. And this is very important for us. This is what forces us to survive, to create a new kind of society beyond capitalism. We can no longer survive within capitalism. Capital will suppress us. This is just what I wanted to comment.
I'd like to add on to this, especially in the light of your introduction, Cliff, and the title that you put on this gathering, First Peoples Day. The really important, significant thing that Gustavo is pointing out is that millions of people around the world have taken into their own hands the decision that their future does not depend upon must not depend upon global institutions, must not depend upon the kinds of treacherous negotiations that are attempting to integrate, to assimilate them into what are devil's deals. I think that today in Mexico, we have an extraordinary flourishing of people who are looking for and are finding ways of moving along and joining with other communities around the world to attempt, no, I'm sorry, not to attempt, to build their own responses, not only to the pandemic, but to the notion that they're marginal, that they're impoverished. It doesn't make any sense anymore for a community to allow itself to be categorized as the government agencies would have them do, as poor, as marginal, and therefore of necessity of social assistance programs that just have not worked because they're not designed to work. I want to end this, but it's not only in Mexico. I mean, we see the extraordinary flourishing. I've had the marvelous opportunity of joining with groups in British Columbia, in Western Canada, and they are building their own kinds of enterprises, their own kinds of activities to go back to be able to live and take advantage of, but protect the environments in which they live, the natural, and to appreciate and to enhance the natural heritage that is so much, or a part of, has been so much a part of their society. That's extraordinarily important. It's going on throughout the world. I mentioned, and I would like to mention again to people who are listening here, if you want to find out more about these kinds of organizations, there is this website called iccaconsortium.org that I would recommend people trying to find out more about. It's very exciting to collaborate with the people in Nayarit in Mexico, the Nayeri, the Huicharica, the Mayas who are members of this consortium and whom we're now inviting lots of other groups to become part of. But in closing this little round, I want to take up again what Gustavo just said about the contributions and the understandings of Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich understood this, the importance of this process. Gustavo used the word hospitality. Ivan used the word conviviality. And I would recommend, in addition to Gustavo's own very, very abundant literature on this material, that people think about looking at Illich's essay on conviviality as a very important way of rethinking our social relations among ourselves.
We have a question that has come in from Bob Stone. Let me put it up on the screen here. Dear Gustavo, you say that in the Maya Zapatista languages, there is not a word for we. I have been told that in those languages, we includes the parts of Mother Nature that surround the group. Can you help me understand how Zapatista communities understand their relation to Mother Nature?
Hi, Bob. Well, I said that there is no word for I and you, but there are many we's. And of course, the most important we that they use is a we that clearly includes all the elements of Mother Nature. There are different variants of this. There is one expression that it's very difficult to translate to English. Crianza mutua is mutual upbringing, something like that, used by many indigenous peoples. And what they basically say is they can nourish the soil, the plants, the animals, the mountains. But the mountains, the animals, the plants are also nourishing you, that you are raised by them in the same way that you are raising corn or whatever. This is the profound notion. They are not only, the we includes the other parts of nature. That is the most important we for all the indigenous peoples. But it is also that there is a profound relation of mutual upbringing. You are generated, produced, created by nature in the same way that you have a dialogue with nature and you create it. We have in Mexico, of course, the most wonderful example. Our ancestors created, invented corn. Corn was not waiting for them to be discovered. What was another kind of plant, and to a magnificent long dialogue, they invented corn, and then corn invented us. We say that we are people of corn. We say, for example, that the milpa, that magnificent agronomic system, is a system based in the principle of hospitality, in which the three basic plants complement each other and they are hospitable to many other plants that we call quelites. 100 plants can coexist. Modern agribusiness tried to destroy it. Glyphosate, that horrible, we are fighting against glyphosate in Mexico today. It is used to destroy these bad herbs. These are magnificent plants hosted by the milpa, and the campesinos cultivate and use them. This is a perfect example of hospitality and how nature, Mother Earth, created us in the same way that our ancestors, invented corn.
If you take seriously the kind of relationship that existed between indigenous communities and their land and nature as a commons, it was the fact that that was all in common that held the community together. I mean, that's something that we've seen after the restoration of communal lands after the 1910 revolution in the ejido system. It was the ejido system, the common caring for the land, that helped to maintain and sustain communities. And so in a very real sense, the we of the community does include that relationship to the land. We have another, go ahead.
This is a complex story, but I think it is a very interesting story. in fact, what we have, the Mexican Revolution was basically implemented, fought by the majority of indigenous peoples and campesinos that were dispossessed during the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. And with Zapata, they fought for land. But it was very interesting to discover that the reaction during the creation of the Mexican Constitution in 1917, they were resisting these revolutionaries, the demands of the campesinos. And finally, they adopted 3 systems of land tenure. That is private property. Well, the first principle, the land belongs to the nation. Then the nation can constitute private property, giving to a person a piece of land. Then they can constitute ejidos, and they can constitute what is called the agrarian community. I will say something more about the agrarian community because they were really resisting, and it was not possible. It was the agrarian community is the communal land for the indigenous people. It was only with the Cárdenas that they started to give land to the communities. And even Cárdenas did not know how to give land to the communities as a community, because in the ejido, they give the land to a collection of individuals. They cannot operate as individuals with an individual piece of property, but they are a collection of individuals. And here it is interesting to discover the origin of the word. Ejido is a word used in Spain, comes from exitus in Latin, that means exit. And it was the land at the exit of the villages where the Spanish campesinos have their common land, where the pasture, the forest, these kind of things. When the Spaniards came to Mexico, to what they call it the New Spain, to this continent, they saw a wide variety of communal regimes. They did not have words for that. And then they started to say, oh, they are like our ejidos. And then the word stayed. When the indigenous people started to fight with the Spanish crown to reclaim their own land, expropriated by the Spaniards, they used the word they were using, ejidos. And they started to write to the Queen of Spain, give me back my ejidos. And that was the fight. And they succeeded during the colonial period. At the end of the colonial period, at the end of the 18th century, they have 15 million hectares reclaimed, where they were having what was called then Indian republics. But they have their land and their own way, of course, subordinated to the colonizers. They were forced to give tribute to the crown, but still they have some kind of autonomy. That was destroyed with independent Mexico. And at the end of the 19th century, these people had no land at all. There were semi-slaves with the big hacendados. That was the origin of the revolution. That was the rebellion. They wanted the land back. It was the revolution was, give me back my ejidos. But the liberals in writing the Constitution could not think about this, really, could not imagine the communal land. And then they reinvented and reformulated the idea of the ejido as a collection of individuals. They cannot think of a real we. In a communal land, in what is called today agrarian communities, you have the land for the we, not for a collection of individuals. It is very different to the notion of land for the ejidos.
It's very important in this context to understand that almost a very, very substantial amount of Mexico's forest lands are still in this organized and exploited in this concept of we, the communal land. And it's Mexico's forest lands are about 1/4 of the total the total area of Mexico, about 50 million hectares. But in addition to that, there's another significant part of Mexican territory, which is still in these communal, in this communal kind of organization, that communities are struggling to insist, to struggle to assert their rights to control. And that is a very, very important part of the present realization, the kinds of organizations which Gustavo's talking about, the kind of area that the Zapatistas have reclaimed. I think we have to, perhaps some of our listeners here today may not even understand that the Zapatista territory is a gigantic territory in which 500,000 people live, and which is an area, to put it, the numbers probably don't make any sense, but it's an area which is larger than the country called the Netherlands or Holland. And throughout the country, the control of water resources and the use of water resources is highly disputed, precisely because the Mexican Constitution assigned all water resources to the state, but the traditional use of these water resources continues to be a source of collective struggle throughout the country.
Just a footnote, Cliff, in Oaxaca, 100% of the forests are communal. After a big, fantastic struggle in 1982, where they reclaimed these forests and finally got them back.
Well, and the Valley of Mexico, the indigenous populations in Oaxaca Valley have successfully negotiated that they have the right to manage the aquifer within that area, and that's a revolutionary. It's a very revolutionary victory that is only now being understood.
Apropos this, we have another question from Metsu Louis. How many caracolas are there in Oaxaca? Does each have people who speak the same indigenous language, or many? How are they connected? I think maybe she means Chiapas, but
yeah, in the Zapatistas call it caracoles, their boards of government, self-government, and they have 5 caracoles in the Zapatista territory. In Oaxaca, and this is an important comparison, Chiapas had almost no agrarian reform. The indigenous people were basically dispossessed. And then the possibility of having land really came with the Zapatistas for most indigenous people in Chiapas. And the indigenous people in Chiapas represent more or less 1/3 of the total population. In Oaxaca, the indigenous people represent the majority of the population. And we have a very peculiar condition. In the basic political unit in the Mexican system is the municipality. And there is something called the free municipio, municipio libre. It's in the Constitution, is one fundamental unit of the political existence of Mexico. Well, in Mexico, we have 2,500 municipios. Oaxaca, that has less than 5% of the population of the country, have almost 1/3. We have 740 municipalities, and these municipalities have 12,000 communities. Well, in most of these municipalities, we have more than 500, we have something that can be described as caracoles, because we have in these municipalities what legally is called usos y costumbres, that it is something different to the area of political parties. In these communities, the political parties cannot participate in any form of elections, and in fact, we don't have elections. We have there, in more than 500 municipalities, in most of the territory of Oaxaca, we have a system of assemblies. And instead of elections, we have the expression of the collective will. It is fascinating to see the process. More or less the year which you will produce the change of authorities, by January, you start to discuss who can be candidates to become the most important position, the president. And you need to have performed all the cargos of the village to be a candidate to become president, meaning that you have provided service to the community your whole life. Since you were 10 years old, 12 years old, you started to give some honorary service to the community. And then when you occupied all the cargos in the community, then you can become a candidate to be president. Then in January, the people start to count how many people can be candidates. And they discover there are these 14 people can be candidates. And they start to discuss in the homes, in the cantina, everywhere. Oh no, this guy is drunk, we cannot elect him. Oh no, this guy is very sick. And they start to eliminate candidates. Then by March, you have only 5 left. By June, you have only 2 left. And then by October, there is only 1 left. And then you have an assembly. And everybody knows the outcome of the assembly. The community will tell the guy that he will be the next president, that the community is imposing on him this cargo. And then the tradition is that this guy should say no. No, I can't, I have too many debts, I cannot do that, it is impossible, I am sick. He must argue against, basically to demonstrate that he is not looking for power. But finally, he will be convinced by the community and then accept the responsibility that the community is giving to him. Then we can call that kind of things caracoles. And then we have more than 500 caracoles in Oaxaca.
Let me add 2 things to that. One, the Zapatistas, if Gustavo can correct me, but the Zapatistas expanded from 5 to 8 caracoles at the end of last year, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that is right. That is right. Yes.
And but there's another important thing that's happening since 1994. And because of the experience in Oaxaca, the notion of usos y costumbres as a way of forming local governments has become a very important demand of many communities around the country. And most recently, in the past 4-5 years, an exciting thing has happened because the Supreme Court of Mexico has now recognized that even when state constitutions don't accept or don't include the notion of usos y costumbres as a way of forming municipal government, the constitutional right of indigenous communities to self-governance and to autonomy, which was incorporated into the Mexican Constitution as a result of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People at the beginning of this century, has led to the creation of a great many, more than a dozen autonomous municipalities in other parts of the country. One that I'm particularly familiar with because I'm speaking here from Morelia, Michoacan, is a community called Cherán, which has a very, very interesting history. And the lawyers that were involved in prosecuting this created the jurisprudence in the Supreme Court to pave the way for this to also take place in, I think it's now taking place in 6 or 7 other states in the Republic.
Cliff, I am now in a crisis. As I mentioned at the beginning, I was forced to escape from San Pablo Etla, where I live, because internet collapsed there. Then I came to Unitierra in the city, and then my computer is at the point of collapse because it has no longer the battery, and I'm not connected to anything. I don't have the cord, etc.
Oh, okay.
Then and I also need to come back to my village
Mhm.
in a few minutes. Then I have only 2 or 3 minutes more left.
Yeah, well, we're reaching the end of our 90 minutes, so the timing is perfect. You know, sorry that you will have to leave us momentarily, Gustavo, but before you do, before your battery fails, I want to give you a very warm thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us today. I also want to give a great thanks to David Barkin for his contribution to our discussion. It's been very informative, and I'm sure that many of our viewers who don't know the Mexico Profundo as you do find this glimpse into a different reality, very provocative. And hopefully this discussion can be continued.
Of course, dear Cliff, see you soon. Thank you for the invitation. Bye, David. See you soon.
Un abrazo.
Okay.
Un
Thank you.
abrazo virtual.
Sí.
Thank you both for a very interesting presentation. And I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it today as well. Our listeners should know that all of our revenue raising programs have been canceled due to the coronavirus. Nevertheless, the Center for Global Justice continues to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, please do so at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Thanks to the Global Justice team that makes these webinars possible, Olivia Canales, Coletta Moria, Roberto Robles, Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestras, and Betsy Bowman. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, which you can access from our website. And there you will also find past webinars and a schedule of upcoming webinars. Next week, the topic will be United States foreign policy and the 2020 elections, anti-imperialist struggles in the years ahead. This is a presentation by Purdue University political scientist Harry Targ, who's been very active in anti-imperialist work in the United States. So next Monday, 1 o'clock, same time, same station. Hope to see you again. And
Cliff,
thank
just
you.
one
Yes.
Just one comment. You made a comment in closing. You talked about Mexico Profundo. It may be that some of the people who are listening today don't really appreciate the importance of that expression. An anthropologist who unfortunately died very young, Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, wrote a beautiful book called Mexico Profundo, which explains some of the roots of what we're talking about today. And it's available in Spanish and English with the same title, Mexico Profundo. I think it was published in the States by University of Texas Press. And just another literary note about the whole issue of we in the language and the whole understanding of the meaning of language and the way in which we relate to nature, in which the language itself relates to nature. There's a whole series of literature written by an extraordinary sympathetic man called Karl Lenkersdorf. And I recommend, if anyone's interested in exploring some of the subtleties of what was discussed today about the notion that we can't talk about I and you, and we can't have a conversation among individuals, but we interact. Karl Lenkersdorf's books and articles are a beautiful window into that world. Thank you very much, Cliff, for the generosity of the Global Justice Center. Someday I will have the opportunity to revisit you in San Miguel Allende, but if I do so, I will bring my own water.
Good. It will be a treasure, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, you have too much arsenic in your water, in the bottled water.
Well, actually, yeah, our bottled water, we import it from Querétaro.
Well, we can talk about whether that's better.
Yeah, who knows? Well, thank you, David. Good to see you again. And if there, I don't know if YouTube is still with us or not, but with that, we're signing off for now. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.